Peace. This is King Noble Black Supremacy. And with this particular video, I want to talk about Moorish sovereign citizens or sovereign citizens versus black supremacy or black supremacists. I want to touch on this. And before I even get started, a lot of Moors are going to tell you, they're not sovereign citizens, that there's a different philosophy between the Moors, Moorish nationalists and sovereign citizens. And that's fine. There are many different types of Moorish nationals or Moorish Americans that don't identify with the sovereign citizenry movement. But there are Moorish sovereign citizens and Moors who've taken a chapter out of the book written by the sovereign citizens. So they've learned and have assimilated some of the sovereign citizens' information. And like I said, there's a such thing as a Moorish sovereign citizen. Some of their documentation and paperwork is consistent with the sovereign citizens movement. But I want to deal with sovereign citizens in general and not just Moors. But I felt like the Moorish sovereign citizenry will be most relevant to melanated people in North America and otherwise. That the Moorish sovereignty movement is kind of home. But I want to deal with sovereign citizenship in general. Now, a lot of times, as a black supremacist, I have police encounters here or there doing this or that. And those police always ask me, am I a sovereign citizen? That just comes to mind, I guess, the way I present myself or not having any ID or whatever makes them say, well, are you a sovereign citizen? And I don't believe anyone could be a sovereign citizen because it contradicts itself. Because you can't be a sovereign and a citizen. To be a citizen is to be actually under the sovereign and under the sovereignty of the government. So to be a sovereign citizen is to say you're a citizen that is not under anything. Because a sovereign is the supreme law, is the supreme state, the supreme power, the supreme governing body. So when you're a sovereign, you're at the epoch, you're at the head. You make the rules, you make the laws. And to be a citizen is to accept that you're subject to those laws and you're under those laws wherever that territory or wherever that jurisdiction is. So to just say you're a citizen already means that you're under the law, which means that you're not the sovereign. You're not a sovereign, you're under the laws. You're obligated to the government. So you can't be a sovereign and a citizen. You really can only be either one or the other. You're not higher than the people who enforce the laws of that jurisdiction. If you're a citizen of that jurisdiction, if you claim a citizenry. But now let me go further. So I don't feel like you could be a sovereign and a citizen. It's only one type of citizen, and that's a citizen. And it's only one type of sovereign, and that's a sovereign. However, when you're traveling abroad into other jurisdictions, you take on the sovereignty of the nation that you're a part of. So if you travel to another country, you take on the sovereignty of the United States of America or the sovereignty of whatever country that you come from as a citizen of that country. But in your own country, you're just a citizen and you don't have that same type of sovereignty that will be expressed abroad. Or what little bit of immunity that you would gain from the sovereignty of the country that you're a part of. You do not have that inside of the jurisdiction of that country. So I can't, when they ask me if I'm a sovereign citizen, I'm saying, that's a contradiction. You can't be a sovereign and a citizen. Now the difference between the black supremacists and the sovereign citizens is when you deal with the Constitution, you have all your rights or your amendments that give you rights or that you acknowledge to be your rights or inalienable rights. But you're missing one thing that causes most of the confrontation and conflicts that Moors and sovereign citizens go at it with law enforcement and go at it with different states is that the Constitution did not give you the right to interpret it. There's no amendment that gives you the right to interpret the Constitution, and that's the biggest problem. So if you don't have the right to interpret it, you cannot not even say that you even read it, that you even understand it, or that your position on it is valid. You do not have the right to interpret it. It can only be interpreted by the the judicial body. If you're not a part of the judicial body, you really do not have the right to interpret it. Matter of fact, the people who are arresting you, the law enforcement officers, they don't even have the right to interpret it because they enforce the laws, not interpret it. So what are they enforcing if they don't have the right to interpret? So you're arguing with someone that is just irrelevant, and it makes the act of policing null and void and very just whimsical and random because someone's enforcing a law that they can't even interpret. And a lot of times the Moors ask them, well, why haven't you read the Constitution? And what is your oath of office? Are you going to keep your oath of office? But a lot of times these cops and police are not reading the Constitution and studying law because they know they do not have the right to interpret it. It's ironic as that shit might sound, that they don't have the right to interpret it. They can only enforce it, which is a big hole in the matrix, that they can enforce something that they don't even have the right to really interpret it. So when you start arguing with them, they say, well, you're going to have to take this to the judge. So you're really arguing with the wrong person if you're arguing with a law enforcement officer about laws that they don't even have the right to interpret. And your arguments are irrelevant. And they have no foundation to them because your interpretation is not the overall conclusion. You cannot make the final interpretation. Your interpretation is not law. And a lot of these people that citing supreme law and quoting the Constitution is acting like that they have the final interpretation of this law, that they're speaking finality, that they're speaking what is exact. And it's not the case. It's just their speculation or their perception. But their interpretation is not valid unless it is taken to someone who has the ability to interpret it. So when you're dealing with law enforcement, you already know off the bat that why are you arguing with someone who cannot even interpret the law? Who don't have the power to interpret? Why is the argument even there? It should go straight to the judge, to someone who can interpret the law. So that's you didn't remove over 90% of the traffic altercation by realizing it's only the judicial body can interpret the law. You're not the judicial body, so you cannot interpret the law. You can't present your interpretation of the law to a judicial body and let them look over it and see if it is consistent with their interpretation of the Constitution, but to argue with a cop is null and void. So until the Constitution is amended and gives you the right to interpret the law, then everything you're saying it has no value. All the emotions and the anger and hostility and the injustice that you feel that is based on law, it has no real place. Because if you embrace the law and you respect the law, then you would realize that the legal system and the government, how it's set up based on the Constitution, you would actually acknowledge that you have no right to interpret the law. So that will cut out your argument completely. All the arguments, all the confrontations, it will be over within 24 hours. What us as black supremacists realize is that we should have the right to interpret laws that are dealing with us. Not only should we have the right to interpret that we are our own selves, our own legislative, our own judicial and enforcement branch of government, that we are all that for ourselves, period. We're walking around as that. We're the judge, jury, and the executioner. That's what a black supremacist is, period. So we acknowledge that interpretation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is as relevant as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness itself. Follow me with this. That the most important of all your rights is the right to interpret as a human being. If you do not have the right to interpret, you have no rights at all, no matter what those rights appear to present to you. If the interpretation is not in your hands, you have no power. Interpretation is consciousness. Interpretation is perspective. Interpretation is culture. Interpretation is an individual's right to perceive reality and to process what is perceived in a way that fortifies their self-determination. So we say throw out the damn Constitution. Because we don't have the right to interpret it. It's not ours. That's like Christianity and dealing with the Bible. Only certain priests, Levites, had the right to really deal with the law and administer the laws and interpret the laws. So if you reading this book and you're not a priest, a Levitical priest, then you don't even know what the hell you're reading. You don't even have a right to give your interpretation of what you're reading. You can do it, but your interpretation is not law. The documents and paperwork that you're handing over and the quotations and statements you're making, they're not law. They're your interpretation or the interpretation of somebody who has taught you. But the final interpretation will come from the judicial body. But you all are too impatient from that because you want the same freedom, independence, and liberation that the black supremacists want. You don't want to be under their ass at all. You want total freedom, total sovereignty, in its totality. That's what you want. But the contradiction is the sovereign and citizen. The contradiction is trying to present yourself to be under or respect a government that you don't give a goddamn about, that you are literally actually against. It's not mere paperwork errors. It's not just about de facto policing and people operating under color of the law. You hate this government. You hate this system. You have just found a way to articulate it to make it appear as though you don't. But you hate it. But the way you deal with it shows that you have no respect for it. Because if you had respect for it, then your arguments will go straight to the judicial body. You wouldn't be arguing and fighting with police, letting them bust out your windows and pull you over and snatch you about your car. Because you know they don't even have the power to interpret law to begin with. So how much information, how much they know, how educated they are is irrelevant because they're not the ones to interpret it. Matter of fact, you don't even have the power to interpret it. According to the same Constitution that you say gave you the rights, that give you the amendments. You're a baby in this country. Baby line. You're not mature enough. You're not accepted to be mature enough or conscious enough or conscientious enough to interpret the laws, no matter how studied and educated you are, how intelligent, how much your IQ is, how articulate, how well spoken you are. You're not trusted to interpret the book, the Constitution, or the information regarding your travel, regarding your life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness in this country. That's the harsh fact that you are not given a right to interpret it. That's just the harsh reality. So if you don't have a right to interpret it, then the whole book itself is outside of your jurisdiction. It's not your book. It's not written for you. It's written in regards to you, but not for you. It's not your book. Let it go. It's an argument you cannot win because you cannot win an argument when your interpretation is null and void. And that's what the Moors keep running into. The interpretation is null and void. That is your opinion. That is your perspective. But who determines if it is the facts? Who determines if it's a law? Who determines if that's the way it go? The very people that you say you claim to be against. As black supremacists, we're stepping out of that argument. We're not concerned about that argument. We know we have the right to interpret our own reality. And anyone who would say that the interpretation of our reality or laws or information that is relevant to our existence, that we don't have that right to interpret that, anyone who could say that would be an enemy to us, and their book would be an enemy to us. Anyone who would take time to say you don't have the right to interpret your own reality. You don't have the right to interpret something that is written to govern you, that your interpretation is irrelevant and insignificant. That is the dehumanization. To remove the power or the significance of your interpretation is to immediately dehumanize you. That's immediate dehumanization. Immediately, that your opinion doesn't, and that's what they're dealing with in court. When they go to court, it's like, well, your interpretation doesn't matter. Your perspective doesn't matter. I'm the judge. I'm the this. It doesn't matter. This is how it goes. This is what it is. You don't matter. You don't matter. Your interpretation don't matter. Are you still spewing out laws and amendments and Supreme Court rulings? And they telling you, your interpretation don't matter. Your interpretation don't matter. Your interpretation don't matter. So now it's like, fuck them. We have to make our interpretation of life itself matter. We have to make ourselves valid beyond merely trying to persuade someone to see the value in our interpretation who don't give a goddamn about us and who believe that they are higher, superior, and more powerful than us to begin with. This is King Noble Black Supremacy. Join my website, www.kingnobleBlackSupremacy.com. Signing out.